We're going to begin this hour with the fragile ceasefire in the Middle East. Iran is accusing the U.S. and Israel of violating the agreement amid Israeli attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon. A day of national mourning has been declared in Lebanon after Israeli strikes killed more than 200 people yesterday. Speaking with our partners at BBC News this morning, Iran's deputy foreign minister said the U.S. must choose between war and ceasefire.
It was a grave violation, intentional grave violation of the ceasefire. You cannot have a cake and eat it at the same time. That was the message that Iran sent quite clearly, crystal clearly to Washington and to the Oval Office last night.
Let's bring in CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer. Okay, it feels like things are changing by the minute here. So where do we stand with the ceasefire?
Well, the ceasefire is holding just. The question is whether it's going to be solidified by these negotiations that are supposed to start in Pakistan on the weekend. So here's the situation. When the Pakistanis announced the ceasefire on Tuesday night, the war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon was explicitly listed as being covered by the ceasefire. The very next morning, Israel launched this ferocious attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the Iranians went, hey, wait a minute, that wasn't supposed to happen. That's covered by our agreement. The U.S. and Israel said, actually, no, it's not. So that's where we are. There's a standoff. The Iranians are now saying, fortunately, they haven't said we're going to start shooting again. But they have said, you better cut this out. We want to see an end to the attacks on Hezbollah, or we will not come to Pakistan to start talking with the United States, those negotiations that are at the moment being led or are supposed to be being led by Vice President Vance.
So then, Liz, the question, of course, is what effect has the ceasefire had on traffic in the Strait of Hormuz? As you indicated from your earlier reporting, the Iranians have once again closed it down, or at least are only allowing limited traffic through the strait because of this recent strike by the Israelis.
Well, if you're confused, I'm confused, and so are ship owners. I had a look at the figures just before I came on air, and the number of ships moving since the ceasefire has declined. 11 yesterday, 4 today. It seems to be because ship owners just don't know what to make of these contradictory statements coming out of Iran. So we heard from the deputy foreign minister this morning that the Revolutionary Guards are saying the straits are open on condition that ships come to the Iranians first, and the Iranians will steer them safe passage through a minefield that may or may not be there. Ship owners are also not sure whether they're going to have to spend $2 million worth of cryptocurrency as a sort of tariff toll to get through. So for the moment, most of them are staying at the top of the Persian Gulf, waiting to see whether, any clear rules or prices emerge. There were some Iranian oil tankers moving through the straits, but of course that oil is not going onto world markets. It's basically just going to China. So it's not looking good, and it's certainly not looking clear.
Yeah, Liz, I love how you put that. Steer through a minefield that may be there or maybe not, because that's really the question. I mean, there's so much uncertainty for these ship owners who would actually send such precious cargo through the strait. All right, Liz Palmer, thank you so much. Let's
go straight to CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi, who's joining us from Washington. Olivia, Vice President Vance will lead talks with Iran this weekend. Is a permanent agreement possible? I heard the vice president yesterday saying the president holds all the cards. It doesn't appear that way.
Good morning to both of you. Yes, it is an interesting question because right now the U.S. is projecting some cautious optimism. We heard from the vice president yesterday on his way home from Hungary, where he said the U.S. is fundamentally in a good spot. Despite what we just heard from Liz there, the vice president said the strait is open, the ceasefire is holding, and there will be talks later this week. The vice president also said that Israel agreed to check themselves when it comes to Lebanon, because that appeared to be really the start of the unraveling yesterday. Once there were those strikes in Beirut, as Liz just laid out, then we saw the closure of the strait again. He also touched on the fact that there have been kind of these back channel conversations happening. There's, one track of conversations that he says are good conversations, fruitful conversations that are happening with the Iranians, and another track which is them publicly saying that there is no ceasefire, that they are walking back from that. But still, we have learned that the vice president will be traveling very soon to Pakistan. He'll also be going with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, for these negotiations with the Iranians. And we know that the Iranian side is planning to leave at some point today as well.
And Olivia, the president met with the NATO Secretary General. He's obviously criticized a lot of the nations that are in NATO for how they're handling this conflict with Iran. What came of it?
Well, from the president's side, a lot of anger came from it. We heard him several times on True Social over the last 24 hours. Several hours after his meeting with the NATO Secretary General, he posted on True Social, "NATO wasn't there when we needed them, and they won't be there if we need them again. Remember Greenland, that big, poorly run piece of ice." Then again this morning, the president said, "None of these people, including our own, very disappointing NATO, understood anything unless they have pressure placed upon them." And of course, the meeting yesterday with the NATO Secretary General was behind closed doors. It lasted roughly 2 hours, and it was tense at times. Secretary General Rutte went on CNN after and said, it was tense conversation. He understood where the president was coming from. He tried to convey to him that some NATO countries have allowed the U.S. to use their bases, to use their airspace. And there's a conversation happening right now in Europe with European allies to try to police the Strait of Hormuz once the bombing stops. But still, the president is asking to see details of, one, that plan, but two, wants to see more of a proactive response from NATO. But of course, NATO will say we are a defensive alliance, and this was an offensive move from the U.S. and Israel to attack Iran. So therefore, there is no need for NATO to have a full, fruitful response to that. The White House would say, well, you get the majority of your oil from there. We are expecting to hear from the NATO Secretary General later today, later this morning, and we'll have to see if there is any movement towards perhaps a less tense relationship between the U.S. and the NATO bloc.
All right, Olivia Rinaldi reporting for us this morning. Olivia, thank you very much. For more on this, I want to bring in Robert Murrett. He's a retired U.S. Navy Vice Admiral and a professor at Syracuse University. Admiral, I want to talk about the Strait, but I just want to pick up a little bit of what Olivia was reporting earlier just now as you were listening in. As a person who spent most of your life in the United States Navy with this overarching mission, the United States as the balance of power in the world post-World War II, along with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, now threatened to be upended by President Trump. Even if a traditional Republican were to be elected in 2028 or a Democrat who opposed the current president's views on that alliance, has irreparable damage been done to NATO? Do our allies even trust us so that even if we were to stay and remain in the alliance, that they don't know that we would have their backs? The president keeps talking about them having ours. I wonder if our allies believe that we have theirs.
Yeah, Vlad, a great question. And just full disclosure, I'm a NATO guy. I participated in my Navy career in 4 different NATO assignments. So perhaps I'm a little bit one-sided on this. The NATO alliance is vital. And there's no question that it's been damaged just a little bit based upon some of the dynamics that have taken place over the last year or so. But I think it's going to recover. All of the NATO nations continue to cooperate very carefully, and maybe one of them is not as strong as and invested in as they used to be. But I think the NATO alliance is going to be just fine. And I also would anticipate some additional input from the Congress because NATO does enjoy very strong support in both the Senate and the House. And that's a dynamic that I'll expect to see play out in the weeks and months ahead.
And Professor, Vlad was mentioning the Strait of Hormuz, so I'll go there now. I mean, this really feels like the crux of it, especially when you're thinking about how the American people are experiencing the war with oil prices rising and therefore gas prices. Given your experience with naval operations, is it possible to secure the Strait of Hormuz? I mean, what would it actually take from a strategic perspective?
Yeah, Kelly, great question. The short answer is bottom line up front, not really. And it's more a function of emerging tactics at the operational and tactical level from a maritime standpoint, but also the geography, which favors Iran so much relative to the Straits of Hormuz. Back when we did Operation Earnest Will, that some of us were involved in back in the 1980s, there weren't the preponderance of unmanned surface vehicles, unmanned airborne vehicles, unmanned subsurface vehicles, swarm attacks by small boats with large munitions enough to damage very vulnerable oil tankers. So with the change in tactics, the way the geography favors the Iranians, just if you look at a map of the Straits of Hormuz and their control they have on both sides of it. And moreover, a final comment, you really can't secure the Straits of Hormuz with deterrence and an air campaign, because a lot of the weapons that can be used to hazard merchant shipping through the Straits of Hormuz can be built in garages and basements. And just the ability that we have to go after, say, a large weapons depot and neutralize Iranian threats to the Strait of Hormuz is really not in the cards anymore.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting question, Professor. I'm curious as well. And of course, I'm thinking back during the Cold War, where you could blockade the Russians from bringing missile components to Cuba. So you're saying, even though our military is incredibly powerful, the most powerful on the planet, that we wouldn't be able to do something from a military perspective, either including naval forces and aerial forces, to prevent the Iranians from closing down the strait.
Yeah, Vlad, a great point. I would characterize it not just closing down, but really to call it hazard. The real decision on whether the Straits is open is a business decision, and specifically by the insurance carriers that have to have a willingness to insure highly vulnerable merchant ships, not just POL carriers, but also fertilizer and container ships. But holding at hazard ships and not being able to underwrite insurance for them going through the Straits. And that's a business decision. The Navy, our combined navies, can do all that they can to try to provide security, although escorting through the Straits of Hormuz is very tough as opposed to open waters. And as I say, what it comes down to, I think, typically is what the insurance carrier is willing to do. The bottom line from all that is that you have to have some kind of understanding with the Iranian government to keep them free. And also, final comment, accepting that Iran can charge tolls or be the controlling power for who goes through the Straits of Hormuz is new and different. And that would be a major inflection point that would be dangerous, I think, from an economic standpoint to global industry.
Yeah, that is new. Before President Trump launched this war, it didn't cost $2 million to go through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, apparently it does. Robert Murrett, thank you very much, sir, as always. We appreciate you having on.
Sure.